Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Your Body Has Your Back podcast.
Woo!
Today, we're diving into the roller coaster you didn't know your gut and hormones were on. So in this episode, we are diving into the roller coaster that is blood sugar, one of our favorite topics. Let it be known the list of favorite topics is long, but blood sugar is definitely at the top because it's a hugely significant role in so many areas of health. In particular, the health of our gut and our hormones. Blood sugar is a key foundation of holistic health that when out of balance, aka on the roller coaster, can be exacerbating to gut and hormone symptoms, but it's also powerful enough to stand alone as a root cause of those symptoms in some people's bodies. So it is definitely a topic to tune into, as we are going to provide you the tools today to understand the blood sugar roller coaster, how it impacts your health, and most importantly, what you can do to get yourself off the roller coaster for good. So thinking about how do we get off this roller coaster, especially if you're buckled in, first we got to start with talking about what is blood sugar. So Jilly, you want to take it away?
Yes. So I'm excited to talk all about what blood sugar actually is, what blood sugar balance means. But I just first want to really echo Abby and kind of put it out there that if you want to balance your hormones and heal your gut, you need to regulate your blood sugar first. If blood sugar is imbalanced, it's going to make it very, very challenging for any other system in the body to function optimally on a basic level. So blood sugar is really kind of the first step. And not only is balancing blood sugar fundamental for supporting a healthy gut and balanced hormones, it's also essential for supporting the brain, cognition, metabolic health, the thyroid, the adrenals, the stress response system, and so much more. Blood sugar balance is just truly something that you cannot bypass. And in our experience, we've found that there is just so much confusion around really what true blood sugar balance actually is and what it means. And 99% of the time when I start working with clients in practice, we are starting by making adjustments to their nutrition fundamentally to support better blood sugar balance. And I've found that really no matter where someone is at on their health and healing journey or how well-versed truly they are in nutrition, I find that there are just always adjustments and things that can be tweaked and optimized foundationally to promote better blood sugar balance. And this can be something that actually leads to a lot of immediate benefits with symptoms. And in other circumstances, it may not be, kind of the be all end all if someone has a little bit more of a solid foundation built, but we may need to make some tweaks before we can kind of move into other aspects of nutrition and lifestyle, since again, it is just so fundamental. And I'm curious, Abby, in practice, do you feel like with your digestive health clients that you're kind of diving in, starting off with blood sugar balance? Are there other things that you feel you're prioritizing, even sooner than that?
I would totally agree, as blood sugar is one of the absolute fundamentals. And it's interesting, you run a practice really focusing and specializing in hormones. I run a practice focusing and specializing in the gut. And what both of us run a practice specializing is supporting the holistic body. And blood sugar impacts it all. It's the hormones, it's the gut, it's the brain, it's every single part of our body. And that's really, again, it's fundamental no matter if you're focused on your gut, your hormones, or any other part of the body. It has to be something that we are paying attention to and really strategizing around in order to kind of best build the lifestyle for the individual around blood sugar. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the first things that we're really working with.
And, to your point, Abby, too, it's kind of like the blood sugar imbalance can be the driver itself, right? With gut issues, with, other hormonal issues. And it can also just be something that is amplifying issues, or it's creating, some holes and shakiness with the foundation. So other, kind of interventions and strategies for support aren't sticking because, we haven't laid that foundation. I also want to point out that when I say balanced blood sugar or blood sugar issues, the first thing people think about typically is diabetes. So they hear imbalanced blood sugar, wonky blood sugar, and they think about, that's only relevant or pertinent for someone that has prediabetes or diabetes. And it's not something, we need to think about until we have, those more severe blood sugar issues or specifically a diagnosed medical condition like diabetes. And I really want to point out that blood sugar balance is crucial for everyone, always. And we should all be thinking about ways that we can support optimal blood sugar balance. And I wanted to just share this little statistic to put this into perspective for you. So the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control, estimates that 1 in 3 US adults are pre-diabetic and 80% don't know it. And I just want to say that again. So it's estimated that 1 in 3 US adults are pre-diabetic and 80% are unaware. So this is actually a huge problem. And, it's something that is just not talked about enough for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But I want to highlight this to really drive home the fact that even if you have not been told blood sugar issues are relevant for you, this is something that, we really should all be paying attention to. And I don't say this to scare you, because the cool thing is blood sugar balance is predominantly influenced by nutrition and lifestyle. And blood sugar is something that we very much have control over. And we'll be diving into kind of action steps and things like that in a few minutes. But I just want to highlight the fact that, blood sugar is important for a lot of us. And there is a lot of opportunity here to be able to support your body in better blood sugar balance. Early stage blood sugar issues can lead to major health issues down the line. But well before a full-blown disease state is present, imbalanced blood sugar can drive a lot of unpleasant symptoms and create a lot of disruption with the gut, with hormones. And this is really exactly why we created this episode. So we want you to feel confident in why this is important and how to actually, be able to support balanced blood sugar. But again, before we kind of dive into all the things, I want to just take a minute to talk about what the heck is blood sugar? What does blood sugar balance mean? Since we do find there's just kind of a lot of confusion about blood sugar out there. So let's quickly review some of the basics. So when we're talking about blood sugar, essentially we're talking about when we eat food, specifically carbohydrate foods, things like your, breads and rice, pasta, potatoes, fruit. When we eat these carbohydrate-rich foods, they are broken down into glucose or sugar, which then enters the bloodstream and causes blood sugar to rise. So we get a rise in blood sugar after eating these carbohydrate-rich foods. Glucose, this sugar that I'm mentioning, is the primary and preferred source of energy used to support our brains, our central nervous system, our muscles, our organs. Our body really likes to use glucose as an energy source. And when the body senses a rise in blood sugar after eating, the pancreas starts to release a hormone called insulin in response to this rise in blood sugar. Insulin being one of the key hormones involved in managing blood sugar levels. So we eat a meal or a snack containing carbohydrate foods, blood sugar goes up, the body starts pumping out insulin, and it's then insulin's job to take that glucose, that sugar, and transport it out of the bloodstream into our cells, where it goes to be used for energy or it's stored for later use. So this kind of built-in mechanism in the body is what helps to keep blood sugar from getting too high. So when we're talking about balanced blood sugar, really the goal is to, eat that meal that has, carbohydrates and a variety of other components, but, the carbohydrates are broken down, and we want to have a kind of a nice slow rise in blood sugar. And we want the body to produce insulin appropriately and to kind of easily usher that glucose into our cells. So we're not, having a lot of blood sugar and insulin hanging around in the bloodstream. And throughout the day, balanced blood sugar would kind of resemble slow rolling hills. So we eat that meal, we get a slow gradual rise and then a slow gradual decline in energy throughout the rest of the day. So what we want to avoid in terms of what imbalanced blood sugar looks like is big, rapid, kind of sharp spikes in blood sugar and insulin, and big crashes or lows in blood sugar. So when we're getting these big spikes and crashes, that is what we consider to be imbalanced blood sugar. Abby, I feel like you have some fun analogy like at the tip of your tongue in relation to talking about balance versus imbalanced blood sugar. If anyone doesn't know, Abby used to be a school teacher, and she has like the best analogies on the planet.
You like see me over here being like, talk about the caterpillar.
Yeah.
Talk about the caterpillar. So the idea of, how we came up with the title is really the idea of a roller coaster. And as much as like socially, we might have a grand old time. I do not. I'm very easily prone to nausea. But a grand old time on like the big loop-de-loop roller coasters, like that's not actually the way that we want to live our lives. Like we've all had those, highs and lows, and they don't actually feel great to be on the high highs or the low lows. Like what really feels balancing to our body and our nervous system are those kind of slow rolling hills. So I like to think of it as we're trying to get ourselves off of the loop-de-loop roller coaster and like more towards like the Caterpillar ride that like, again, socially might not be really where like in high school we wanted to hang out in that line because we were all like the grandmas and the little kids. But really that's where we want to be in like our lives. Just like picturing yourself on the Caterpillar ride, having the ride of your life because your nervous system is balanced and your blood sugar is balanced and you are feeling even energy and all the things that Jill is going to tell us a little bit more of later as to what do the high highs feel like and the low lows feel like. So we can really understand, like, are we on the loop-de-loop roller coaster or have we transitioned ourselves onto the Caterpillar ride, which let's make that the cool kids ride from now on.
I am here for the Caterpillar ride. I am like number one in line.
I am the Caterpillar ride.
So if we are chronically riding this wild blood sugar roller coaster, this actually creates an inflammatory pattern in the body that can be really challenging to get out of. So when we get these big spikes in blood sugar and insulin, this directly stimulates an inflammatory response in the body. When we have low blood sugar or big blood sugar crashes, this actually activates a stress response in the body and causes the body to release stress hormones like epinephrine and cortisol. I think something that many people are not aware of is that cortisol, so we all know cortisol as being kind of one of the primary stress hormones. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, and one of its primary jobs is to keep blood sugar stable and balanced. So when it senses that, the body senses that, energy is scarce, we don't have enough glucose to be able to kind of, fuel all of the body's systems, it's going to sort of send off the alarms in the body, and we're going to start pumping out these stress hormones like cortisol. And, cortisol is going to tap into glucose stores in your muscle, your liver, and it's going to start dumping sugar into your bloodstream to normalize things because it wants to use that as an energy source. And in that situation, the cortisol will also basically tell your cells to become more resistant to insulin because it wants to maintain those blood sugar levels. So just to kind of describe that, that low blood sugar, the blood sugar crash, it's really activating a pretty significant stress response in the body. And that's a protective mechanism. And it's pretty cool when we think about it. And, in terms of some things you might notice if you were riding that blood sugar roller coaster, I think some of the big things I see in practice with clients would be, kind of issues, mood-related issues. So feeling like angry, irritable, anxious, especially if we go too long without eating. I'll notice clients will feel, kind of shaky, maybe lightheaded, which is another, kind of sign that we may be riding that roller coaster. Experiencing strong sugar and carb cravings in between meals is a big one. Also feeling tired or lethargic after eating. And another common one would be brain fog, poor memory, just kind of that like cloudy, foggy feeling. That's also really common when, we're riding that blood sugar roller coaster. So those are just kind of a couple things I could really go on and list a laundry list of things here in terms of symptoms. But I want to pass this over to you, Abby, to kind of talk a little bit more about, some of what can actually be driven by blood sugar imbalances, like both from a symptom perspective and from like a health condition perspective.
Yeah. And blood sugar really can cause a whole host of symptoms in the body. And the list is really so varying, it might actually surprise you all that one seemingly simple concept of blood sugar can actually impact so many areas of health and dysfunction in the body. So really, to kick it off, imbalanced blood sugar can exacerbate IBS and digestive symptoms. So we're talking about bloating, loose stools, constipation, the list goes on. And how it works is by activating a stress response where in the gut, that stress response reduces our digestive secretions. It damages the gut lining and it reduces the blood flow. Blood flow to the gut is imperative to maintaining gut health and healing the gut. So imbalanced blood sugar will also drive inflammation and increase the production of gut irritants. These are called endotoxins that can further entrench that inflammatory cascade that's driving all those symptoms. So we can again see blood sugar as being an exacerbator, like a Molotov cocktail into these dynamics, or it can be the actual root cause of many of these. So again, kind of why we're talking about it on episode 2. But the list doesn't stop there. So then we can experience anxiety. So those mood issues that Jilly was noting can be a major symptom of blood sugar imbalances, as the highs and lows of blood sugar, that roller coaster, can activate and mobilize stress hormones, cortisol, that can lead to our experience of anxiety or irritability or just sharp changes in mood. We can have sleep issues. These are, again, often driven by that activation of our stress hormone, cortisol, which directly inhibits melatonin production, which is our sleep hormone. And we can have disruptions in deep sleep and can also cause us to wake early in the morning, really between the times of 4 and 5 a.m. That's really can be due to an elevated surge of stress hormone cortisol that mobilizes blood sugar from the liver, leading us to wake, even stimulating waking with anxiety for some of us, and often before our bodies are naturally wanting to wake. That sleep interruption is such a huge piece. Blood sugar imbalance plays a significant role in driving dynamics of PCOS. So that's polycystic ovarian syndrome. And that can really be due to excess cortisol and insulin driving the ovaries to overproduce testosterone, which is a key factor in PCOS. And this is really Jilly's major area of focus. And maybe, Jilly, you can talk a little bit too of the PCOS dynamic and even how it relates to fertility. I think it's a fascinating piece of what you actually do have control over when it comes to some of these conditions that many of us feel like we don't have ownership or control of our own experience in them.
Yes. So when it comes to PCOS and blood sugar, I think many of us are aware that there is a connection here. But I don't think everyone is aware of what a big deal this is. So it's estimated that around 75% of women and maybe more with PCOS experience some degree of insulin resistance. And when I say insulin resistance, basically what that means is, when you eat the meal containing carbohydrates, blood sugar goes up, the body produces insulin, and insulin is trying to bring that glucose, that sugar, into your cells. It's ringing the doorbell on your cells, but the doorbell's broken. So insulin cannot easily get that glucose into your cells. And when the body senses that blood sugar is remaining elevated, it starts to pump out more and more insulin. And this insulin, this excess insulin, directly stimulates the ovaries, the theca cells in the ovaries, to produce more testosterone. And high androgens, testosterone being a primary androgen, is what drives a lot of issues with PCOS. So that's what, kind of can prevent ovulation from occurring regularly, and it can contribute to all sorts of unpleasant, issues, acne, hirsutism, head hair loss, all sorts of things. So there's a lot of talk about, blood sugar and PCOS. But I think the big problem here is that we're only talking about high blood sugar, right? So anyone with PCOS, just in my experience, that walks into their doctor's office, they are asking for help, or maybe they're just getting a PCOS diagnosis. No matter what, they're pretty much told to cut carbs, eat low carb. And everyone is getting this blanket recommendation, and no one is taking into account the fact that, low blood sugar and the crashes that we're talking about are just as harmful as the big rapid spikes in blood sugar. So, that's a really big deal. And we also know that testosterone and androgens are not just produced by the ovaries. A good proportion of them are produced by the adrenal glands, which also regulate cortisol and stress hormones. So if we're getting the big blood sugar, crashes, or we have low blood sugar and we're jacking up, cortisol and stimulating the adrenals, we may end up in the same exact place in terms of having all of these androgenic symptoms contributing to the progression of PCOS. But, we're not in that classic like high blood sugar situation, I guess, in terms of what people think about. And my point here really just being that this blood sugar is nuanced. And especially for people that have blood sugar issues or insulin resistance that we're talking a little bit about, it is not just about bringing blood sugar down. It's about true blood sugar balance.
That's such a good point, because I think most people, when they hear blood sugar, they're avoiding. They're like, oh, I don't eat bread. Oh, I don't eat cookies.
Exactly.
Like, oh, so my blood sugar is great. And it might be, but we also have to think of all of the various things that are involved in that blood sugar conversation. And that's exactly what we're diving into to really give you those tools.
Exactly. And, just to touch really quickly, so I won't go off on another tangent here. Clearly, I could talk about this all day. But in terms of the fertility piece of things, fertility is something that women often feel like is just out of their hands, and it's not. There are certainly things that, may be out of our control, but there are a lot of things that are in our control. Nutrition being a big one. Lifestyle, pieces also being really important. But when it comes to blood sugar specifically, we know that imbalanced blood sugar, so that, crazy, wonky roller coaster ride, actually can negatively impact egg quality. And egg quality is very important. It's not all about, quantity in terms of having a large number of eggs. It's really about the quality. And supporting stable, balanced blood sugar is one very, very strong, important way that you can support egg quality and therefore support fertility.
I mean, these are the topics that fire us up, because these are the exact tools that everyone has so much influence over in their lives. And it can be in relation to some of these topics that feel like they feel big and they feel scary, and they feel like, oh, we need a medication for this, or we need to go get a test to see if we're, good or bad or otherwise in this dynamic. And really, the choices that we make daily through our actions and our nutrition choices and all of that have such a big role. And that kind of leads into to our next point of hypothyroid can be exacerbated due to compensations from our excess stress response of cortisol. So a lot of people think hypothyroid or anything thyroid and immediately think thyroid medication is the only way to combat any thyroid issues. And, medication can be a tool that is really useful for some people, but we're still needing to think about, why is that happening? We always need to be asking the why for PCOS, the why for fertility issues, the why for hypothyroid, the why for autoimmunity, which we're going to talk about in a second. And when we start to break down the why, we actually start to empower ourselves to realize oh, we actually have a role that we can play. And maybe, we still need some support. We still need some fertility support. We still need some hypothyroid medications or what have you. But we have maybe more participation in this than we thought before. And that's really the exciting part.
Yeah. And that's the whole point of this episode, right? Is to highlight the opportunity in all of this in terms of, how impactful and important blood sugar is, but also that a lot of this is in your control, which is so cool.
Yeah. And certainly we're all going to dive into those topics in much more on future episodes. We could probably say that after everything that we say. So I'm just going to let that be a blanket statement. So the idea of autoimmunity. So autoimmune risk and frank autoimmune conditions can be exacerbated by the excess inflammatory cascade and stress response that negatively impacts everything from our gut barrier to our immune defenses. So again, focusing on blood sugar is a actual something that we can do to reduce our risk of developing autoimmune conditions or furthering the development of autoimmune conditions if we already have one. Because when we have one, there's a greater risk of developing another autoimmune condition within the next 5 years. So those are the types of tools that we really want to be keeping in our toolkit. blood sugar imbalances also impact our cognitive function and can drive dynamics such as dementia or Alzheimer's due to the inflammation and frank damage to the blood vessels in our brain and our gut. So much so that blood sugar imbalances have kind of a additional nickname of being type 3 diabetes due to the significant role that they're playing in driving dynamics of reduced cognitive function, risk of Alzheimer's, all of those pieces. We were talking the other day, Jilly, about a client experience that you had when we were kind of building this episode. And I thought it was so fascinating, the story of a client who was doing all the right things, it seemed, if you looked, quickly at her checklist on paper. But really there was a huge piece that she was missing. And I feel like that story would be so interesting to hear.
Yeah, it's such an interesting client story. And, so basically a client had come to work with me who was struggling with a variety of issues, but predominantly with chronic sleep issues. So for 3 or 4 years prior to us starting to work together, she was dealing with some pretty severe insomnia, a lot of difficulty falling asleep, a lot of difficulty staying asleep. And, she was waking in the early hours of the morning, which Abby had kind of just touched on. So in this 3 to 4 years prior to working together, she had gone to different providers. She had actually gone to more than one sleep clinic and some pretty big, well-known sleep clinics, actually, done sleep studies. She had tried a variety of medications, trazodone, doxepin, all the things. And she was rigorous about sleep hygiene and was using all sorts of herbal supplements and things like that. Nothing was working. She sought out support from a functional medicine doctor who did some testing, put her on all sorts of supplements. Nothing improved. And, when we had started working together, actually in our first session, I learned that she was strength training 5 days a week. She was, going on walks every single day, big walks. She was also intermittent fasting. So she was, going long stretches of time without eating or practicing time-restricted eating. The way that she was practicing this form of intermittent fasting too, which we see often with clients, is skipping breakfast, which really is just creating a very, very prolonged overnight fast. She was also eating a really low carb diet, a low calorie diet ultimately. And on paper, she felt like, she really looked like, okay, I'm doing all the right things. I'm, exercising a lot. I'm paying attention to what I'm eating. I'm intermittent fasting. I'm doing the low carb thing. And I'm, experiencing all of this sleep disruption. And this, really jumped out at me at our first session. And I asked her, has anyone asked you about what you've eaten before in all of these, with all these doctors you've seen, functional, conventional? And she said no. And it was just so profound to me because she was drastically under eating, just under fueling her body on a very, very basic level. And then layering on the fact that she was also eating very low carb and really demanding a lot from her body in terms of, these rigorous workouts and lots of walking and movement. And so we kind of got to work and started putting some things in place to adjust the basics and to build a really supportive foundation for her, to make sure that she was eating enough, that meal frequency, meal composition, we're supporting balanced blood sugar. And we worked together for about 4 months. And really within like the last 2 months of working together, because, it took some time to kind of establish these new habits, make these changes, and also for her body to respond. So we have to give that time as well. But really within the last 2 months of working together, it was a night or day situation with her sleep. And I remember so vividly that she kept very detailed sleep logs. And for like the last month that we worked together, 7 to 9 hours every single night for a month, no medications. We weren't using sleep aids, anything like that, which was just incredible. And she was at the point where providers were recommending that she explore using lithium for sleep, which is not a medication that you take lightly. So it just goes to show you how important blood sugar balance is, but also how overlooked it is. And, in our kind of healthcare system, oftentimes we are jumping over the diet and lifestyle basics to medications that we actually could have the opportunity to avoid.
That client story is
wild.
Yeah, like so fascinating, but hopefully so helpful to hear too, of how significant some of the foundations can be.
Exactly. It's just, yeah, it's really crazy. And that's, definitely an extreme case, but it's not an unusual case, honestly. And I don't know if you agree, but I feel like there's all sorts of different client cases and situations I've been in where I'm like, man, how did we overlook the blood sugar stuff, right? When it is so important.
Yeah. I mean, I really like to think of it as like, let's build the foundation, the blood sugar, the, sleep habits, the, looking at exercise, all that stuff, and then see what falls away. Because there's a lot of like static that kind of quiets and you're like, oh, and then kind of steps forth the like, all right, we've got an entrenched dynamic over here and things. And now we've got clarity on what actually needs deeper curiosity and support and all of that. And it really can be, a significant amount of things. Some of the most frustrating symptoms for people can be the ones that, not overnight, but within the first couple of months start to just kind of quiet and just almost to the point that people are like, oh, was that something I was struggling with before? You're like, yes, it was actually one of your biggest complaints.
I know. It's so funny. It's like, I know it's crazy. And I couldn't agree more that when you do establish that supportive foundation with things like balanced blood sugar and, some of the things that we talked about in our first episode and that we'll be kind of diving into in some of our following episodes, when you do support those basics, there's just so much more clarity, right? It's helpful because then you can understand, all right, where do we need to go next? And you're not just kind of in a mucky mess of all the wonky things. So in terms of the average person, listening to this podcast and sort of letting all of this soak in terms of processing how important blood sugar is, what do we do about this? How do we navigate this in our healthcare system? So what I want to mention here, and I don't take this statement lightly, is that our healthcare system does not make money off of people being healthy. They profit off of people being sick and requiring medications and procedures and things that are expensive. Insurance companies just don't make money off of preventative care and people not requiring these things. And despite blood sugar issues being something that, you can really identify very early and reverse with diet and lifestyle, our healthcare system and, kind of conventional providers are often just running like the bare minimum when it comes to labs, not diving into asking about what people are eating, what their symptoms are. So it can be a little bit frustrating for the average person to navigate, honestly, on their own. So now we want to just talk a little bit more about why this is not being addressed more so in our current healthcare system. And we also want to give you some things to think about or some tools for really advocating for yourself in terms of, blood sugar, health in general, and just navigating our healthcare system. So I want to point out right off the bat that despite blood sugar balance being so important and all of the research we have around, how influential blood sugar is on all of our systems, our healthcare system does not make money off of people being healthy. Our healthcare system, and insurance in particular, profits off of people being sick and requiring medications and procedures. So there is not a lot of action being taken, despite all the knowledge that we have, to pick up on, those early signs of blood sugar issues, to, whether it be with labs or with, asking people about their diet and lifestyle and their symptoms. So there's just not a lot of things being done because it's not how our healthcare system profits, unfortunately. And I don't take that statement lightly, but it's the reality of, our current healthcare system today. So when it comes to labs and your PCP and kind of what you're having done annually, you may be having, some basic things done, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But one of the problems too is that reference ranges that are used are so large in our kind of conventional system. So when there are abnormalities, they aren't being flagged. they're not being, picked up on, and we're not using that as an opportunity to actually like reverse things and to address those dynamics. We are sitting around twiddling our thumbs, waiting for there to be a full-blown disease state, which is really frustrating. So, again, we just want to highlight that there's some problems systemically, but we want to give you tools and information to be able to really advocate for yourself when it comes to preventative health.
Hear ye.
So in terms of what labs you should ask your provider for specifically, we would recommend a few key things just to get a good look at what's happening with blood sugar. A fasting glucose, a hemoglobin A1C or A1C, and a fasting insulin. So these three things are a very good starting point to kind of get a good sense of what's going on with blood sugar. Ideally, in terms of, kind of optimal reference ranges versus normal, right? We don't want normal, we want optimal. So in terms of optimal reference ranges, ideally we want a fasting glucose to be anywhere between 70 and 90. We want our hemoglobin A1C, which is it's a measure of your average blood glucose levels over the past 3 months. We want that to be below 5.3%. And we want our fasting insulin to be below 7. Those are kind of the optimal ranges that we are aiming for. And those will likely be different than what you see sort of reported on, the blood lab report. And that's just kind of a good basic starting point. Oftentimes providers might run a fasting glucose, maybe even an A1C. In my experience, it's very rare for providers to run a fasting insulin unless you specifically request it. But I do find that that's a very, very helpful marker because sometimes fasting glucose A1C can actually look normal. But if you run a fasting insulin, you can pick up on early signs of insulin resistance if this marker is elevated. And that would be just an amazing opportunity to make some more specific adjustments if you were able to identify that. Again, you will probably have to request it because it's not something, that we're seeing checked routinely with clients. So those are the things we would recommend starting out with. But even if all of your blood labs look normal, and not just normal, optimal, if they're within the ranges that I just mentioned, that's amazing and, definitely something to celebrate. But you're still going to need to focus on balancing blood sugar because, again, everyone can benefit from thinking about supporting blood sugar, balancing blood sugar. And this is really, really preventative. So...
And we talk about advocating for yourself and really giving you these labs and these things to ask for. As part of that advocating for yourself, when you go to ask your provider to add on a fasting insulin, maybe even just because you're curious, you're like, hey, I listened to this podcast and like they were talking about fasting insulin and like, I'd love to know where mine is because I feel good today, but I want to have a reference point in a year or 2 years or 5 years when I ask to run this again. Yearly would be recommended, so that we can know where we are now. And if they dismiss you and belittle you and tell you that, that's something that you don't need to worry about, or like that's an expensive lab, or that's something that, that they're not participating in even your own curiosity about your health. And I don't say this lightly. We don't say this lightly. Maybe you find another provider. Like if your provider is not having a conversation with you about your health, especially something as routine as one additional lab, then that's someone who is not partnering with you. So, just putting that a little bit like tucked in for information for you. I've certainly had these uncomfortable conversations with clients before who have really had some challenging conversations with providers. And on the other side, there are some of my clients who have amazing relationships with their providers. So you deserve to have a provider who feels like a teammate.
100%. I could not agree more. Your provider works for you, right? And it should be a partnership. It shouldn't be kind of a one-way street, but ultimately if they're not supporting you adequately, it might be time to ask some questions or, find a great provider that will. Mm-hmm. So Abby, do you want to kind of dive in and talk a little bit about blood sugar disruptors? We've kind of like vaguely mentioned a few things, but do you want to kind of dive in and talk about some of the big things that we see contributing to blood sugar imbalances?
Yeah, absolutely. So the dark side. So first we have to start with food. So frequency and composition of our meals are a major driver of imbalances in blood sugar. This certainly pertains to what you are eating, but it's also important to realize the role of how you are eating and how that plays a major part in blood sugar balance also. So the first is erratic eating schedules. So such as pushing off breakfast or going long periods of time. So that's like an excess of 3 to 4 hours between meals can lead to low blood sugar, is what we were talking about with the dynamics earlier. And that can trigger our stress response to help compensate for those low blood sugar. And this is often the stimulus for why going without a meal can make us feel hangry or irritable. Imbalanced meals in terms of not enough protein, fiber, or healthy fat in relation to carbohydrates is a big blood sugar trigger. We often only think of sugar or refined carbohydrates like flour, flour-based breads, donuts, baked goods as the culprits for driving elevations in blood sugar. But it's equally important to recognize that food works as a team in the body, and balanced meals require the presence of all of the main macronutrients. So Jill's going to hit on this point more in a minute. And then the biggie that you already know we will be talking about a lot here is under-eating calories or even under-eating certain macronutrients. So similar to the story that Jilly shared about her client, consuming too few calories, such as the often touted 1,200 to 1,500 calorie meal plan. I know, my God. Or even following a too low carbohydrate diet, shocking, can actually trigger the stress response in the body, which, as we discussed earlier in the episode, is a major driver of imbalanced blood sugar. So we also can't forget the importance of nutrient density as a part of our food intake. So the quality and types of foods that are lower in nutrients and minerals can negatively impact blood sugar balance. So this highlights the importance of real whole foods. That means eating more ingredients in your diet than prepackaged or processed foods. So another big irritant, I would say, of blood sugar is a lack of minerals. Just going to pause for dramatic effect, another of our favorite topics. So minerals are imperative for balanced blood sugar. The biggies in terms of minerals, potassium, magnesium, sodium, as these key compounds help to balance our body's stress response and also support our cells to actually pull blood sugar out of the blood and use it for energy. And we want the blood sugar out of the blood and into our cells. That's how we actually get to use it and feel good as a response from it. So let's talk about stress. We've said stress a multitude of times. So what are some of these stressors? So this includes both emotional and physical stressors. So both of these can drive our stress response, which triggers the release of cortisol, that's our stress hormone, that when out of balance can cause tremendous dysfunction in the body and in blood sugar. So the stressors that you might not be thinking of as a stress include excess fasting or prolonged fasting. So yep, I'm talking about intermittent fasting when we push off breakfast in the morning to 11, 12, even 2 p.m. Do we even consider that morning anymore? This is especially important for our menstruating females to hear, as our bodies are more sensitive to stressors due to fluctuations in our monthly cycles, and long-term prolonged fasting can end up working against us. Another stressor is excess high-intensity exercise. So that is a stressor, possibly a beneficial stressor, but again, not when done in excess or when done in a body that has too many other stressors present. So other stressors, we're thinking low caloric diet, we're thinking lack of sleep, we're thinking emotional stress. Maybe there are imbalances of blood sugar. Too much exercise, like high intensity HIIT training or intense spin classes, might just be too much. Too much of a good thing is a stressor, or too much of a stress, quite frankly. And exercise is a stress. And we have to look at the whole human experience of that individual.
And I feel like a lot of what you're talking about here and with the physical stressors, it's a product of diet culture, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's the idea that health is going to be achieved through eating less, working out harder, punishing the body, deprivation, like all the stressful things that I think many of us from a young age, we have the idea ingrained that these things are actually healthy and supportive. But really, what Abby's describing is all of these stresses combined, it's not taking people closer to health. It's actually taking them farther away.
Yeah, that's where we that mindset, that awareness, that pause of, hey, I'm wanting to go back to either more exercise or less calories or more of these stressors, or like, that's where we need to create the pause in those patterns and really work to say, like, nope, I committed to the nourishment of my body. I committed to listening. And that's really where we see the amazing healing. And it doesn't happen overnight. So it's the commitment to those fundamentals. And, that conversation of sleep, like lack of sleep, that is a major stressor. So if we aren't creating the time for rest and recovery through optimal sleep quality and quantity, this is too going to be something that's going to go into our theoretical stress bucket. And when the theoretical stress bucket starts to overflow, we're going to have some major symptoms. And that certainly can be blood sugar symptoms, but it can also be a whole host of other not fun symptoms, that anxiety, that all of those other things that we talked about. And the last here is our gut imbalances and inflammation. So often culprits driving digestive symptoms, skin conditions, fatigue, brain fog, the list goes on, are major stressors in the body. So kind of what's causing the why. These might not feel like we have as much direct control over, such as like a gut imbalance. But starting with focusing on blood sugar is a major way to get clarity on what is the root cause of your symptoms. So again, kind of quieting that static. And this is where focusing on the foundations now can help you better understand if or when working with a provider like Jilly or myself is a resource you need to go deeper beyond the foundations. So these are the tools to implement to kind of get clarity and really see, what do you need support around? So now that we talked about all the negative stuff, like, what can we do starting tomorrow to actually wake up and balance our blood sugar?
Yeah. So let's talk action steps and kind of build on some of the things that Abby, just mentioned. And actually, even before I dive into that, with everything that you were just kind of outlining, Abby, really going back to the stressors, the physical stressors, a lot of this boils down to context. And it's not that, time restricted eating or intermittent fasting is never beneficial, or that, HIIT training, high intensity exercise is never healthy or helpful. And it's really ultimately all about context and, being able to assess the situation and to choose to make a decision that is actually going to support your body and not, create that stress. And I think this is a really important conversation to have, because, stress, or backing up one second. And I think this is just a really important conversation to have, because it's kind of like, okay, exercise it's a hormetic stressor. It is a stressor on the body. And in the right context, it can be healthy, supportive, adaptive. It can even, lead to improvements with blood sugar balance. In the wrong context, like when we haven't fueled well, we haven't slept, we haven't gotten the 7 to 9 hours of sleep. We have a lot of emotional stress going on. It may not be healthy in that context. And that's where I think, just as a whole, we need to change the conversation around these things and, realize that things aren't black and white ever, right? When it comes to nutrition and lifestyle. And it doesn't mean that, exercise is always healthy. It doesn't mean exercise is always bad. And we have to sort of look at the individual and what's going on there. So just made me think of that with what you were saying, and just how important it is to look at context.
It's the gray area.
It's the gray area. It's where we live. We swim around in the gray all day. So now let's dive into our action steps. So in terms of how do we support blood sugar, what are the big things that we want to do specifically? So building off what Abby kind of mentioned around basic meal timing and frequency, we recommend focusing on eating consistent meals about every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day. If we are going much longer than 3 to 4 hours without eating, we are going to end up with low blood sugar. We are going to jack up our stress hormones, and we are going to feel it physically. So we really just kind of want to think about this 3 to 4 hour timeline as a guideline, a tool that we can use. Does that mean that we want to totally ignore our body's hunger and fullness signals? No. We want to tune in with our body, the biological hunger and fullness signals. So if you're hungry sooner, you should always respond to hunger. But this guideline is helpful to really make sure you're on the right track and you're not going too long without eating. There are lots of things that can impact the reliability of biological hunger cues, like stress. If you have a big deadline at work, you're kind of consumed in a project, or there's lots of things going on, we may not experience those strong, consistent hunger cues until they're hitting us in the face and we're, sort of at that low blood sugar point. So we can use that 3 to 4 hour guideline to kind of make sure that we are supporting our body with what it needs. And what Abby and I talk about a lot is, and really with the whole kind of conception of this podcast, we, talked about this a lot, and really the idea of using a combination of the inner and outer wisdom to guide all of this: nutrition, lifestyle, all the things. So inner wisdom being the biological hunger signals, the outer wisdom being your nutrition knowledge and the knowledge that you have around how to best fuel your body. So recognizing when you may need to rely on one more so than the other is a helpful thing to recognize, so that you can make sure you're not putting yourself in a position where, you're kind of amplifying a stress response or anything like that. So ultimately, let's make sure we're eating consistently every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day. I always recommend starting the day off with a well-rounded breakfast, which Abby, touched on a little bit, and generally eating within 1 to 2 hours of waking, and then eating consistent meals throughout the day after that is a good, sort of starting point. And we know that, eating breakfast at all, so if you're a breakfast skipper or you eat something, and then also the composition of breakfast, these things have a significant impact on blood sugar regulation and your body's response to meals later on in the day. So what I will also mention here is that this is, I think, a particularly important thing to point out for women. To Abby's point, women's bodies, particularly women of reproductive age, more sensitive to stressors. So if we are skipping breakfast, that is going to have a ripple effect the rest of the day, really regardless of what you're eating. So we really want to make sure that we anchor ourselves with that great breakfast and eat consistently after that. We even have some interesting research specifically on women that have found that women that do skip breakfast have an altered or amplified cortisol response midday compared to women that do eat breakfast in the morning. So start our day with breakfast. And, if you're not someone that has been eating breakfast, it's very possible that your body has adapted and compensated for the fact that it doesn't get fuel at that time, and you might not feel hungry. So it may take a little bit of time to make some adjustments and for your body to adapt to having fuel in the morning. So we typically recommend just taking it slow, starting with something small, protein rich ideally, and working up from there. And pretty quickly, hunger cues typically do, reestablish if we can remain consistent there. If you haven't been eating regular meals, I also typically recommend set alarms, set reminders, carve out space, protect space for meals. Your body deserves to be fueled and nourished. And sometimes we can't expect ourselves to remember to eat out of thin air. So we need those reminders. And I can relate to that personally. I don't know if you can, Abby.
Oh, absolutely. I don't really forget meals, but sometimes the timing gets moved around.
Oh, totally.
More track my day with what meal I'm at. I'm well, then between breakfast and lunch, I'm going to do this. And between lunch and dinner, I'm going to do this. But I do understand how things can get moved around.
Yeah. You can kind of get wrapped up in something, and then all of a sudden you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where the time went. So building in those external reminders can always be helpful when you're trying to create new habits in particular. In terms of meal composition, so ideally we want to make sure that we are eating 3 meals a day, and that each of these meals has a balance of protein, carbohydrates, healthy fats, and our non-starchy vegetables. When it comes to protein specifically, we know that research has indicated that we need to be getting at least 20 grams of protein at meals in order to have that blood sugar stability effect. 20 grams is actually still pretty low for most, adults, men and women. And we recommend aiming for about 0.75 grams to 1 gram of protein per pound body weight in total, kind of broken up somewhat evenly throughout the day. That's really what new research has indicated in terms of optimal health. Again, we're not looking for suboptimal or, just preventing, death and disease. We're looking to really function optimally. So 0.75 grams to 1 gram protein per pound body weight, if you wanted to do a quick calculation. And visually, a good reference is about 1 to 1.5, the size of the palm of your hand in terms of a piece of protein at a meal. So that's kind of a good starting point. In terms of protein sources, animal proteins, good high quality animal proteins are going to be a bit more bioavailable in terms of their absorbability. So depending on the type of animal protein, we're going to absorb anywhere from 70 to 90% of that. So they definitely do a really good job of supporting blood sugar stability. And the way that they do that is they slow down the digestion of glucose into the bloodstream. So if we're eating a sweet potato by itself, we're going to get this, decent spike in blood sugar and a pretty quick crash down, even though a sweet potato is amazingly healthy and nutritious and has all the great fiber and vitamins. When we have, say half a sweet potato with a, piece of fish or chicken or eggs, we're going to get a much slower rise in blood sugar than if we were to eat that sweet potato by itself.
Caterpillar ride.
Exactly. And then, we have our plant proteins, which, also can be really awesome. Their bioavailability is a bit less than animal proteins. Anywhere from 40 to 70%, depending on the source. So they don't do as great of a job at stabilizing blood sugar, but they can be, a really, really nutritious part of the diet. And I think generally a combination of both is great, depending on what a person's preferences are. And when it comes to plant proteins, we tend to recommend ditching the imitation meats and kind of the funky, really ultra processed plant proteins and focusing on, maybe the organic tofu, tempeh, legumes, and, those more whole food and minimally processed sources of plant proteins. Carbohydrates. So big message here. I think you probably gathered this throughout this entire episode. Do not fear carbs. Use carbs thoughtfully to nourish and support your body. Everyone's needs are going to be different here, and I'm not going to get into specifics, kind of for that reason. But what I would recommend is focusing on consistent carb intake. So having a good carb source consistently at meals and snacks to provide your body with that stable energy. And to focus on eating that carbohydrate source alongside a great protein. And then play around with it, see how your body feels as you kind of, tweak the proportions of things, and just monitor as you go along. Focus on carb quality. So as Abby mentioned, really aiming to incorporate more of those whole food, minimally processed carb sources where we're getting all the great, vitamins, minerals, and fiber. So, again, your starchy vegetables, your high quality whole grains, your legumes, whole fruit, all of those great things are going to just be really packed with micronutrients, which is a huge piece of things as well. The fiber piece is an important one. So the fiber-rich starches and our fiber-rich non-starchy vegetables, we want to make sure we're getting in a lot of these. So fiber is that non-digestible part of plant foods, so it cannot be broken down, and it is not broken down into blood sugar. So fiber is something else that helps to slow down, the digestion of carbohydrates and prevent, more of those big rapid spikes and crashes. Generally, we want to aim for, 35 plus grams of fiber a day, which can take a little bit of thought, but doesn't have to be complicated or crazy, truly. And then lastly, so in terms of the non-starchy vegetables that I mentioned are also really rich in fiber, aiming for, 2+ cups at a couple meals a day is kind of a good benchmark. And every day might look a little bit different, but that's sort of a good starting goal if you're thinking about, all right, how much vegetables should I incorporate and how do I get started? So we want good quality protein source, plant, animal, combination of both. We want a whole food, minimally processed source of carbohydrates consistently alongside that protein. We want some great non-starchy vegetables in there a couple times a day. And then we also want some complementary healthy fats, our nuts, our seeds, our avocado. And those also help with blood sugar balance as well in terms of slowing down the absorption of the sugar into the bloodstream. And then next up, we have our minerals. Abby, you touched on this really well, and just in terms of like the importance of minerals and how minerals are needed to actually like support insulin sensitivity and bring glucose into the cells. And really, we just want to highlight a variety of those, nutrient-dense food sources, those mineral-rich foods. So dark leafy greens, avocado, pumpkin seeds, shellfish. Those are some great ones in terms of being rich in specific minerals. And it's also important to know that it's kind of tough to really adequately support optimal mineral status just through food, although food is a really important piece of it. And really, this is related to stress, which depletes minerals, and soil quality, which is not as mineral rich as it used to be. So many of us do need some support supplementally, with things like the magnesium, potassium, and sodium, which can be, a great starting point along some of these things as well. I'm like, do you want me I feel like there's no like transitions in here, so I'm like, hey.
I know that was a big chunk.
Okay.
Do you want me to do a little transition of like, what about non?
Yeah. Thanks.
So I love the major focus on so much of the kind of food that is so important. But kind of building off of our conversation earlier, there's so much of non-nutrition related aspects for us to focus on to also support blood sugar. And can you tell us a little bit more about what those might be?
Totally. And, I think you kind of teed this up really well and talked about some of the big things. So I'll just kind of keep it specific to action steps and like what can we do with these different lifestyle pieces for supporting blood sugar. So with exercise, we recommend focusing on incorporating strength training, which is like so phenomenal for supporting lean muscle. And when we have more lean muscle, this makes, our cells become more sensitive to insulin. We have an easier time kind of utilizing blood sugar, which is the goal. So strength training for supporting that lean muscle. And then also walking. So walking is like the most underrated form of exercise ever. And walking really does have so many health benefits. But in particular to blood sugar, walking can be really amazing to incorporate after meals. So when, we're going on a walk, even if it's a short walk, this helps to improve that blood sugar response after meals and to improve that insulin sensitivity. And Abby and I were just talking about too, some newer research that came out earlier this year, I think in January, February, that indicated that we actually don't need to go on big, long walks to, kind of get the blood sugar benefit. And even just a 2 to 5 minute walk after a meal significantly improved the blood sugar glucose response after meals. And even breaking up sedentary time. So just standing, if you work a desk job, that can be helpful as well, which is cool. So strength training, walking, these are kind of the big blood sugar, friendly blood sugar supportive exercises. When it comes to sleep, we want to make sure that we're aiming for about 7 to 9 hours per night, if possible. As Abby had mentioned, sleep deprivation is going to be a big disruptor of blood sugar. So making sleep a priority, in addition to some of these other things, is a huge one. Stress. So, working to consistently prioritize stress reduction outlets, to carve out that space for your nervous system is really important. you could be doing all the right things with food in terms of, balanced meals and meal frequency, nutrient dense foods. But if stress is through the roof, we can actually experience blood sugar issues and insulin resistance from that alone. So, carving out outlets, working on stress resilience, which we'll be talking about in our next episode, actually. Those are some big priorities for supporting balanced blood sugar. And then lastly, optimizing circadian rhythms. So we touched on circadian rhythms briefly in the first episode, and we talked a bit about the importance of light exposure in terms of regulating circadian rhythms. But in general, optimizing circadian rhythms, really, really important for balanced blood sugar. So that's going to involve small habits like a consistent sleep schedule, prioritizing, some natural sunlight in the morning and midday, and being mindful of things like blue light exposure. Circadian rhythm disruption has been found to really significantly contribute to dysglycemia or blood sugar imbalances. So that would be the lack of sunlight, the erratic eating, the erratic sleep schedule, just to kind of highlight a few big things there. So those are sort of the big lifestyle pieces, nutrition pieces in terms of action steps and things that you can really do to start supporting blood sugar today.
Yeah. I was like giggling, thinking about like hot girl walks. I'm like, you don't need to take a 45-minute hot girl walk. And that's for the ladies and the gents out there. We all take hot girl walks. But 2 to 5 minutes of a hot girl like jaunt really is all you need.
All you need.
Exactly. So, and Jillian and I were talking about too, of like, sometimes we have that mentality of like, if I don't have 45 minutes, why am I going to do it? And then we can remember that little nugget of wisdom of like 2 to 5 minutes, man. That's all I really need. Maybe I just walk around my own apartment. If I can get some light exposure and pop outside, even better. But, just standing up, that's enough too.
Exactly. And it's the same idea of like breaking away from that black and white thinking of, all or nothing. And, Abby and I are not immune to this either. So we will be, very open here in terms of the things that come up for us. And we're always working to create better habits. And 2 to 5 minutes, that's all you need.
So on this topic of, I feel like we can't end our episode without debunking some of the blood sugar myths. So now that we've dove into all things blood sugar, let's once and for all bury some very stale myths that need to move the F on. And that's really sugar from fruit. Probably the number one question that, like, if I do a talk somewhere and there's a Q&A section, it's always like, talk about sugar from fruit. And so is it a driver of imbalances in blood sugar? The short answer, if you're eating the whole fruit that includes the fiber, it is most likely not a significant driver alone. To take it a step further, partnering with that fruit with a protein or a healthy fat, we like to call this putting clothes on your naked carbohydrates.
No naked carbs.
No naked carbs will help to even more tie down your blood sugar, and not to mention create a more satisfying snack to help space out eating more optimally, which is a major part of gut health. But we're going to talk about that more in a future episode. I feel like we also get the question about fruit juice, and is that the same as eating fruit?
And, the quick answer there is it's not the same. And, eating the whole fruit is definitely preferred because you do get all of that great fiber that, Abby mentioned, which really helps with blood sugar balance. And when you're drinking fruit juice, all of that great fiber is removed. And that is what is sort of acting like a buffer or slowing down, the impact on blood sugar. Great comparison is, think about eating an apple, like a whole apple, where you're, chewing through the fruit and you're actually like eating all of that fibrous matter, versus drinking a glass of apple juice, which probably has several, apples in there, all of the fiber is removed. So when we're drinking that, it's really kind of just blasting the blood sugar. So whole fruit and fruit juice is very different in terms of the impact on blood sugar. And we definitely recommend the whole fruit and just sugary beverages in general. It's like, it just absorbs so rapidly. It's challenging to control blood sugar with the sugary beverages.
Yeah. So whole foods, really what we emphasize. All right. So to wrap this guy up, it's not just sugar, carbs, or food alone that impacts blood sugar, but our whole human experience, actually. So to summarize, blood sugar balance is fundamental for health. It's fundamental for supporting a healthy gut and hormones. It is step number one, numero uno, for anyone looking to support their health, whether they have blood sugar issues or not, or whether you have absolutely no idea where you fall on that spectrum. It's time to focus on it. So we covered a lot today. So this episode is one that you could revisit, especially if this connects with you as a major area of focus. Think about just starting with 1 to 2 strategies from what we discussed above. Maybe that's working on eating optimal protein in the morning for breakfast, or prioritizing sleep or light exposure. Don't try to overhaul everything at once. Work on those 1 to 2 strategies until they feel comfortable and they feel more second nature, and then add 1 to 2 more. The work is building a foundation that feels sustainable and hopefully also enjoyable so that you can actually plug more into your life in a meaningful way. Because ultimately, that's really what it's about. Plugging into your life and living a life that feels full to you and feels like you can really participate in it. And those are the tools that we are going to continue bringing you episode after episode, because we want to live the fullest life and we want everyone around us to live the fullest life, so we can just raise the consciousness.
Yes, I love it. This was such a great episode. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us and talking about all things blood sugar.
Woohoo!